Walter Bennett sat alone in the courtroom. A 72-year-old retired school janitor accused of stealing thousands of dollars in public funds from the school he had served for nearly 40 years. The evidence was stacked against him. The courtroom was silent, and just as the judge prepared to deliver the decision, the doors suddenly opened. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped inside, Walter's adopted son. Walking beside him was Ranger, his loyal German Shepherd K9. Every head in the courtroom turned. No one spoke, but Ryan had not come simply to listen to the verdict. He had come carrying one piece of evidence, something hidden, something no one in that courtroom had seen before, and what it revealed was about to change everything. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and stay with us until the end, because what happened next in that courtroom didn't just uncover the truth. It brought an old man, his son, and everyone watching to tears. Early winter had settled quietly over Spokane, Washington, beneath a low gray sky that seemed to press the whole city closer to the ground, while a cold rain moved across the residential streets and left the bare trees, parked cars, and narrow sidewalks shining beneath the weak morning light. Walter Bennett was 72 years old and had been retired for nearly 2 years, although almost nothing about the way he lived suggested that he had learned how to stop working. He was a broad-shouldered white man whose body had become slightly stooped with age, with short silver-white hair, deep lines around his pale blue eyes, and large hands marked by old cuts, burns, and calluses collected during almost 4 decades of repairing whatever broke inside a public school. His brown work jacket still hung beside the back door every morning, even though there was nowhere he needed to wear it, and a pair of heavy boots remained beneath the coat hook as if he might receive a call at any moment about a leaking pipe, a frozen boiler, or a classroom door that would no longer close. For 38 years, Walter had worked in maintenance for the local school district, and throughout that time he had become the kind of man most people noticed only when something stopped working. He repaired heaters before children arrived on freezing mornings, climbed ladders to patch leaks during summer storms, replaced broken locks, rewired lights, cleared snow from walkways, and stayed late when school events required an extra pair of hands. He was not a man who expected praise, nor was he especially comfortable receiving it, because somewhere along the way he had decided that useful work was its own explanation. That morning, however, there was something on his kitchen table that no wrench, screwdriver, or roll of electrical tape could repair. A thick envelope had arrived shortly after 7. Walter had carried it inside with the rest of the mail, made coffee, and opened it with the same butter knife he had used for letters for more than 20 years. He expected some ordinary notice from the district, perhaps a retirement document that had been filed late or another piece of administrative mail that should have gone to someone else. Instead, the first page contained his full name beneath the word defendant. The complaint accused him of misappropriating public funds and stealing approximately $68,000 in maintenance equipment and supplies during the final years of his employment. Walter read the figure several times. $68,000. The number seemed almost absurd when compared with the life around him. The kitchen table had been purchased second-hand. One of the cabinet doors hung slightly lower than the others because Walter had never bothered to replace the old hinge. His toaster had one working slot. His refrigerator made a low, rattling sound every 20 minutes, and the chair beneath him had a metal brace across one leg where he had repaired it rather than by another. Nothing in Walter Bennett's life looked like the life of a man who had stolen $68,000. Yet the documents were detailed enough to make even him uneasy. There were copies of purchase orders, lists of materials, vendor records, dates, quantities, and signatures stretching across page after page, according to the district. Walter had ordered tools, electrical equipment, plumbing fixtures, paint, lumber, floor treatment, replacement heaters, and other supplies that had never reached the school. He knew immediately that the accusations were false, but knowing something and proving it were not the same thing, and that distinction became increasingly difficult to ignore as he turned through the pages. The signatures troubled him most. They looked like his. Not perfectly, perhaps, but close enough that Walter found himself leaning forward beneath the kitchen light, studying the angle of the letters and the way the last name curved downward toward the final stroke. Whoever had written them had either copied his handwriting carefully or had access to documents bearing his genuine signature. Walter placed the papers on the table and stared at his hands. Those same hands had signed thousands of forms throughout the years. Supply requests, maintenance reports, equipment inventories, safety inspections. He had never imagined that something so ordinary could one day be used against him for a long while. He remained seated in the small kitchen while the rain tapped steadily against the window, and although he knew several people he could have called, he reached for no one. Walter had spent too many years learning to solve problems alone. His eyes eventually drifted toward a framed photograph sitting on the counter beside an old ceramic bowl filled with loose screws and spare keys. The photograph showed Ryan Mitchell at 9 years old. Ryan had been a thin boy then, with dark hair that never stayed combed and a serious expression that made him look older than he was, while Walter stood beside him in the brown work jacket he had worn for half his career. Neither of them had been especially good at smiling for photographs, but somehow that picture had captured both of them doing exactly that. Ryan was 36 now, a police officer with the Spokane Police Department, and although he had become a confident, capable man who spent his days dealing with other people's emergencies, Walter still sometimes saw the quiet 9-year-old boy whenever Ryan walked through his front door. Walter considered calling him. Then he decided against it. Ryan had his own life, his own work, and enough responsibilities without being dragged into a legal mess created by the school district, and Walter convinced himself that the situation could be handled quietly if he simply appeared in court, explained the truth, and allowed common sense to do the rest. By early evening, the rain had grown colder and the sky had darkened long before dinner, while Walter occupied himself in the garage repairing a loose storage shelf that could easily have waited another 6 months. He was tightening the final screw when headlights crossed the driveway. A dark SUV pulled to a stop near the garage. Ryan Mitchell stepped out first. At 36, Ryan was a tall, athletic white man with short, dark brown hair, a square jaw usually shadowed by light stubble, and steady blue-gray eyes that had become more observant with every year he spent in police work. He carried himself with the calm alertness of someone accustomed to noticing small changes in people, rooms, and situations. Although around Walter there was still an occasional trace of the stubborn boy who had once argued over vegetables and bedtime. The rear door opened a moment later, and Ranger jumped down. Ranger was Ryan's 6-year-old male German Shepherd, K9, a powerful black and tan dog with a dark saddle across his back, upright ears, intelligent brown eyes, and the balanced, muscular build of an animal trained for demanding police work. On duty, Ranger was disciplined, controlled, and intensely focused, but his behavior around Walter was considerably less dignified. Because over the years the dog had developed a particular affection for the old man and seemed to regard every visit as an opportunity to temporarily forget that he was supposed to be professional. Ranger crossed the wet driveway quickly and leaned his shoulder against Walter's leg, his tail moving in a broad sweep behind him. Walter rested one scarred hand briefly on the dog's neck. The simple gesture relaxed something inside him that the entire day had tightened. Ryan noticed the strain in Walter's face almost immediately, although Walter attempted to hide it by moving inside, making coffee, and settling into the familiar routine of an evening visit. For several minutes they spoke about ordinary things: the weather, a traffic signal that had malfunctioned downtown, a neighbor who had begun leaving food outside for raccoons and was now offended that raccoons had accepted the invitation. Walter would have preferred the evening to remain that way. Then Ryan saw the envelope. It lay near the end of the kitchen table, partly covered by a folded newspaper, but the district letterhead was still visible. Ryan picked it up before Walter could offer an explanation. The change in his expression came gradually as he read. First, curiosity disappeared, then amusement, then the relaxed familiarity of a son visiting his father. By the time Ryan reached the accusation of $68,000 in missing public funds, his face had become hard and focused. Walter explained the situation with as little drama as possible, telling him the letter had arrived that morning and that he intended to deal with it himself because he had done nothing wrong and had no desire to turn the matter into something larger than it needed to be. Ryan did not share that confidence. As a police officer, he understood that official documents, financial records, and signatures could become more powerful than memory or reputation once a case reached a courtroom, and the idea that Walter intended to walk into such a situation without legal help clearly disturbed him. Walter remained stubborn. He had spent 38 years inside that school and believed that anyone familiar with his work would know he had never stolen from it. Ryan, however, understood that the problem was not whether people who loved Walter believed him. The problem was what could be proven. While Walter moved toward the counter to refill his coffee, Ryan began reading the complaint more carefully, no longer as a worried son but with the patient attention of a police officer accustomed to searching for inconsistencies. Ranger settled beneath the table, his body resting near Walter's chair while his eyes occasionally followed Ryan's movements. Several minutes passed. Ryan turned one page, then another, and eventually pulled 3 purchase orders from the larger stack. Something in the dates had caught his attention. He placed the documents side by side. The first was dated in August, the second in November, the third in January of the following year. All 3 carried Walter Bennett's name. All 3 contained signatures that appeared to be his. Yet, Walter had retired in April, several months before the earliest of those documents had supposedly been submitted. Ryan quietly asked Walter to confirm the date of his retirement. Walter did. April. Almost 2 years earlier, for the first time since opening the envelope that morning. Walter stopped thinking about the lawsuit as an error that could simply be corrected. He leaned over the table and studied the dates. By August, he had already returned his keys. By November, he had no access to district purchasing systems. By January, he had not worked inside the school for nearly 9 months. And yet, someone had continued ordering supplies under his name. The kitchen suddenly seemed quieter. The rain was still falling outside, and the refrigerator continued its familiar mechanical hum. But Walter barely heard either one. Ranger rose from beneath the table, stepped toward Walter, and rested his head across the old man's worn shoes as though sensing a change in the room that could not be explained by sound alone. Ryan gathered the 3 purchase orders together and looked at the man who had raised him. The anger he had shown earlier was gone now, replaced by something more controlled and more serious. Walter had spent the day believing that someone had accused him of stealing. Now, both men were beginning to understand something far more troubling. Someone had used his name after he was gone. Someone had copied his signature. Someone had needed the records to point toward Walter Bennett. And whoever had done it had not made a mistake. They had chosen him 27 years earlier, long before forged purchase orders and court papers found their way onto Walter Bennett's kitchen table. The same city of Spokane had been caught beneath another cold rain, the kind that turned sidewalks dark before sunrise and made the old brick walls of the school seem even heavier than they were. Walter was 45 then. Younger in the face, but already carrying the quiet habits of a man who trusted work more than conversation. His hair was still mostly brown, with only a little gray beginning at the temples, and his shoulders had not yet bent beneath the years of ladders, boilers, frozen pipes, and heavy toolboxes. He worked the early maintenance shift at the school, arriving before teachers, before students, and often before the sky had fully decided to become morning. He liked those hours because the building was honest when it was empty. A broken light stayed broken until someone replaced it. A leaking pipe did not pretend to be anything else. There were no meetings, no explanations, and no people asking him to make something sound better than it was. That morning, Walter had finished checking the boiler room and was carrying a metal toolbox down the corridor behind the gymnasium, when he noticed that the door to the equipment room was not fully closed. It had been locked the night before. Walter knew because he had locked it himself. He stopped, listened for a moment, and pushed the door open. At first, he saw nothing unusual beyond folded mats, old basketball racks, spare cones, and a stack of broken folding chairs waiting to be repaired. Then he noticed a pair of muddy sneakers beneath a canvas tarp near the back wall. Walter set the toolbox down quietly. The boy underneath the tarp was small for his age, thin enough that the oversized green jacket around him looked as though it belonged to someone else. His dark brown hair had fallen over his forehead in uneven strands, and his face had the pale, tired look of a child who had not slept properly in a long time. One cheek was pressed against his folded arm, while the other showed a faint scrape near the jaw. He could not have been older than 9. Walter knew him. Ryan Mitchell had been enrolled at the school only a few months earlier, and while Walter did not know much about the boy, he knew enough to understand why teachers lowered their voices whenever his name came up. Ryan's parents had died in a highway accident the previous winter. His father, Mark Mitchell, had worked in construction, while his mother, Susan, had been a receptionist at a dental office not far from downtown. Their deaths had been sudden, leaving no time for plans and no clear arrangement for their only child. Ryan had been placed with an aunt and uncle on the edge of the city, relatives who had taken him in because someone had to, not because they had wanted their lives changed. Walter had heard that Ryan had run away twice already. This made 3. The boy woke when Walter shifted his weight. His eyes opened instantly, not slowly, and the speed of it told Walter more than words could have. Ryan did not wake like a child who felt safe. He woke like someone expecting to be caught. Walter did not ask why he was there. He did not ask what had happened at the house where he was supposed to be staying. He simply looked at the mud on Ryan's shoes, the wet cuffs of his jeans, and the way the boy's hands disappeared inside sleeves that were too long. Then Walter picked up his toolbox and left. Ryan watched him go without moving. 10 minutes later, Walter returned with a paper bag from the cafeteria kitchen. Inside was a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a small carton of milk. He placed the bag on an overturned equipment crate a few feet from Ryan, then sat down on another crate and began sorting screws into a plastic organizer as though finding a child hiding in a school storage room before dawn was only another item on his maintenance list. Walter explained in the simplest way he could that Ryan could eat first and speak later if he wanted to. Ryan said nothing. He waited nearly a minute before reaching for the sandwich. Then he ate all of it. Walter did not watch him too closely, because he understood that hunger carried its own kind of embarrassment when someone had been taught to believe needing anything was a weakness. Instead, he kept arranging washers and bolts into neat rows, occasionally pausing to test whether a damaged hinge could still be used. By the time Ryan finished the milk, Walter had learned nothing from him directly, but he had learned enough. A child did not walk several miles through cold rain and sleep behind gym equipment because everything at home was fine. Walter informed the school office that Ryan had been found safely, and by mid-morning a family services worker arrived to speak with him. Her name was Carol Jensen, a compact white woman in her early 50s with short auburn hair, practical glasses, and the tired patience of someone who had spent 20 years trying to solve problems that rarely had clean solutions. She was kind without being sentimental and direct without being cruel, qualities Walter respected immediately. Carol explained that Ryan's aunt and uncle had reported him missing shortly after midnight, and that they were increasingly frustrated by his behavior. The relatives described Ryan as difficult, withdrawn, ungrateful, and impossible to manage. Walter looked through the small window of the administrative office toward the hallway, where Ryan sat on a bench with both hands tucked beneath his legs. The boy did not look difficult. He looked tired. Over the weeks that followed, Ryan began appearing near Walter more often, though neither of them ever formally agreed that this was what they were doing. Sometimes the boy waited outside the maintenance room after school. Sometimes he helped carry a box that was not heavy enough to require help. once. Walter found him watching as he repaired a loose door closer and handed him the screwdriver without being asked. Ryan learned quickly. Walter learned more slowly. He discovered that the boy hated canned peas, preferred peanut butter sandwiches with too much jelly, and never entered a dark room without first finding the light switch. He also learned that Ryan rarely asked for anything directly. If he was hungry, he became quieter. If he was cold, he folded his arms. If something bothered him, he stared at the floor until the feeling passed or someone else changed the subject. Walter began keeping an extra sandwich in the maintenance refrigerator. He told himself it was practical. He began keeping a clean sweatshirt in the closet. That, he claimed, was also practical. When Ryan ran away again 3 weeks later, Walter was the person he came to, this time. The boy arrived after school and stood near the loading entrance with rain dripping from his hair. He had no backpack and no coat. Walter did not ask what happened until Ryan had eaten. Only then did the story begin to emerge in pieces. His aunt and uncle were not physically abusive, but they had made it clear from the beginning that Ryan's presence was an inconvenience. They argued about money when they thought he was asleep, complained about extra food, and repeatedly reminded him how much easier their lives had been before he arrived. When he broke a drinking glass, his uncle had told him that everything seemed to cost more whenever Ryan was around. The sentence had stayed with him. So had many others. Walter understood the damage of such words because they often left no bruise anyone could photograph. Yet a child could build an entire identity around them. Carol Jensen became involved again, and this time Walter asked questions of his own. Not emotional questions, practical ones. What would it take for Ryan to stay somewhere else? What was required for temporary placement? Could a single man apply? Did income matter? Carol studied him carefully before answering. Walter was not wealthy, and no one could have mistaken his life for comfortable. His house was a modest 2-bedroom property with an aging roof that leaked near the back hallway during heavy storms. Much of the furniture had been purchased second-hand or repaired so many times that individual pieces seemed to carry their own history. His old Ford pickup had a heater that worked only when it wanted to, and a starter that sometimes required a gentle strike with the handle of a wrench in cold weather. None of that bothered Walter. What bothered him was the idea that people might confuse limited money with limited care. He began the process anyway. At first, Ryan stayed with him temporarily while Carol worked through the paperwork. Walter gave the boy the smaller bedroom, though the room had previously served as storage and contained little more than a narrow bed, a dresser, and a bookshelf Walter built from leftover pine. Ryan stood in the doorway the first night as if waiting for someone to tell him what he owed for it. Walter simply told him where the extra blankets were. The first month was awkward in ways neither of them discussed. Ryan woke from nightmares but refused to admit he had been dreaming. Walter overcooked almost everything except breakfast. The roof leaked twice. The Ford failed to start on the coldest morning of the month, forcing them to walk 3 blocks to catch a bus. Ryan accidentally broke the handle off a kitchen drawer and spent 20 minutes trying to repair it before Walter came home. When Walter saw the damage, Ryan immediately apologized and promised to pay for it someday. Walter took one look at the broken handle, found another in the garage, and replaced it. He never mentioned the cost. That was one of the first times Ryan began to understand that Walter did not keep a running account of what the boy used. Over time, the house changed. A pair of school shoes began appearing beside Walter's work boots. Homework spread across the kitchen table. The refrigerator contained food Walter would never have purchased for himself. There were arguments about grades, wet towels, unfinished chores, and why a 9-year-old boy apparently believed every flat surface in the house was an acceptable place to leave a jacket. There was laughter, too, though both of them were surprised by it at first. Walter eventually received legal custody, and after more months of home visits, interviews, background checks, and court hearings, he adopted Ryan permanently. He never described it as rescuing the boy. In Walter's mind, There had simply been an empty room in one house and a child who needed somewhere to belong. Years later, when Ryan was old enough to understand how close Walter had lived to the edge financially, he realized what the man had quietly sacrificed. There had been years when Walter repaired his own boots rather than replace them, drove the same failing truck through one more winter, and worked extra maintenance shifts so Ryan could join a school trip or buy equipment for sports. Yet, Walter never once reminded him of those sacrifices. He did not believe love should be presented like a debt. One lesson, however, stayed with Ryan longer than almost anything else. It came when Ryan was 13, after he had backed away from helping another boy being bullied because he was afraid of becoming the next target. Walter had not shamed him for being frightened. Instead, while the two repaired a fence behind the house, he explained that courage had very little to do with whether fear appeared. A good man, Walter told him, was not someone who never felt afraid. A good man was someone who still stepped forward when another person needed him. Ryan carried those words into adulthood. He carried them through the police academy. He carried them into his first patrol car. He carried them into every difficult call where someone frightened needed another person to walk through a door first. And now, 27 years after Walter had found him beneath a canvas tarp in a cold equipment room, Ryan sat at the same old kitchen table and looked at the forged purchase orders spread beneath the light. The house had changed very little. The roof no longer leaked because Walter had finally replaced it himself years earlier. The old Ford was gone. The kitchen drawer still had the handle Walter installed after Ryan broke the original one. Ranger lay nearby. His black and tan body stretched across the floor while one ear remained turned toward the two men. Ryan looked again at the dates appearing after Walter's retirement and understood that the situation had moved beyond a son defending his father's reputation. Someone had created records that should not exist. Someone had used Walter's identity after he no longer had access to the school. And someone had trusted that an elderly retired maintenance worker would not have the money, knowledge, or strength to fight back. Ryan remembered a 9-year-old boy sitting in a storage room while one man chose not to walk away. He closed the file carefully. This time, he would be the one who stepped forward. He would protect Walter as a son, but he would find the truth as a police officer. The next morning, Ryan Mitchell returned to the old school for the first time in years with a purpose very different from the one that had once brought him there as a frightened child. The rain from the previous night had passed, leaving Spokane under a pale winter sky. And a hard wind moved through the parking lot as Ryan crossed toward the side entrance with Ranger walking close beside him. The school looked older than he remembered, not in the sentimental way old places sometimes do, but in the tired way of a building that had gone too long without proper care. Paint had faded around the exterior doors. Rust showed near several drain pipes, and one section of gutter sagged slightly above the loading entrance. Walter would have noticed all of it within 30 seconds. Ryan had not come as an official investigator. The lawsuit against Walter was still a civil matter, and although Ryan was a police officer, he had no authority to search offices, seize records, or question employees as though a criminal case had already been opened. That limitation frustrated him, but it also forced him to move carefully. He had arranged permission to review maintenance records connected to Walter's employment and to walk through areas where some of those materials had historically been stored. Ranger came with him because Ryan was scheduled for canine training later that afternoon and because the dog had been with him almost constantly for years. But Ryan had no expectation that Ranger would become involved in what was supposed to be a quiet visit through old paperwork. The employee who met them inside was Thomas Reed, a 58-year-old white man with a heavy build, thinning gray hair, and the permanently tired expression of someone who had spent too many years under fluorescent lights. Thomas worked as the current head custodian and had known Walter only during the final few years before retirement. He was polite but cautious, the kind of man who preferred not to stand too close to administrative problems. And Ryan could tell from the way he avoided discussing the lawsuit that he had already heard enough rumors to know this visit might eventually matter. Thomas led Ryan through the main corridor towards the maintenance section. explaining that most recent purchase records had been transferred to the district office while older documents were supposedly kept in long-term storage. Ryan listened without interrupting, taking in the condition of the building as they moved. A strip of paint had peeled from the lower wall near the science wing. One ceiling tile carried a brown water stain. Near the gymnasium, a heater rattled loudly enough to be heard from halfway down the hall. None of those things proved anything, but together they left an impression that would not go away. Walter had spent decades preventing buildings from looking like this. Ranger remained composed at Ryan's left side, his 6-year-old black and tan body moving with the smooth, economical rhythm of a trained German shepherd accustomed to ignoring distractions. Students passing in the distance drew only brief glances. A rolling cart squeaked across the floor without breaking his focus. Even when a cafeteria worker dropped a metal tray behind a closed door, Ranger merely turned one ear toward the noise and kept walking. That changed when they reached the old maintenance corridor behind the gym. Ranger stopped, not hesitated. Stopped. Ryan felt the leash tighten slightly and looked down. The dog's head had turned toward a narrow wooden door set between two storage rooms. His ears were high, nose working steadily, body no longer relaxed. Thomas noticed and gave a short laugh, saying the room had been locked for years and contained nothing useful. Mostly old paint, damaged equipment, and things nobody had gotten around to throwing away. Ryan expected Ranger to lose interest once they moved on. He did not. The dog stepped closer to the door and drew air along the gap near the frame, then lowered his nose toward the floor and followed the scent line from one corner to the other. His behavior was controlled rather than excited, but Ryan knew him well enough to recognize persistence. Something behind that door had caught Ranger's attention. Ryan asked when the room had last been opened. Thomas hesitated before answering that he was not sure. He believed Walter had used it years earlier, before the district reorganized storage, but for a long time it had served as little more than a place to dump obsolete material. Ryan asked whether he could look inside. Thomas frowned toward the lock. For several seconds, he seemed to weigh the inconvenience of saying yes against the greater inconvenience of saying no to a police officer who had already been granted access to maintenance areas. Eventually, he went to find the key. While they waited, Ranger remained near the door. Ryan crouched beside him and rested a hand briefly against the dog's shoulder. Ranger's breathing was calm, but his attention never shifted. When Thomas returned with a thick ring of keys, the third one opened the lock. The smell came first. Old paper, dust, dry wood, paint, metal. The room was narrow and deeper than Ryan expected, illuminated by a single overhead bulb that flickered twice before settling into a weak yellow glow. Shelves along the walls held half-empty paint cans, broken mop handles, cracked plastic bins, rusted brackets, discarded light fixtures, and several cardboard boxes softened by age. A damaged ladder leaned in one corner beneath a tarp gray with dust. Thomas stepped inside first and gestured at the clutter as though to prove his point. There was nothing there worth hiding. At least, that was how it appeared. Ranger entered behind Ryan. The dog moved slowly at first, sniffing the lower shelves and the floor, then crossed toward the back wall without being directed. His nose passed over several boxes before he stopped beside a wide sheet of plywood leaning upright behind a stack of old fluorescent fixtures. He sniffed along the bottom edge, then scratched once. Ryan watched. Ranger scratched again, more firmly. Thomas stared at him. Ryan stepped forward and tested the plywood with one hand. It was heavier than expected. Not because the board itself weighed much, but because several rusted brackets and loose metal pieces had been piled in front of it. Together, Ryan and Thomas moved the debris aside. When Ryan pulled the plywood away from the wall, a shallow recess appeared behind it. Inside were 3 cardboard archive boxes. All 3 were coated in dust, but not evenly. The tops were old and gray, while the edges around the lids showed faint cleaner lines where hands had touched them more recently. Ryan felt a quiet tension settle in his chest. He crouched, On the side of the first box, written in black marker, were 2 words, Walter Bennett. The second box carried the same name. So did the third. Thomas muttered that those records should not have been there. Ryan looked at him. Thomas explained that retired employee maintenance records were supposed to have been transferred to district archives years earlier, especially purchasing and inventory material. He had never known these boxes existed. Ryan did not open them immediately, because this was not an official search. He was careful to establish permission before touching anything further. And Thomas, now visibly uncomfortable, called the school administrator and received approval to review the contents in place. The first box contained maintenance logs, supply requests, handwritten inventories, work orders, and copies of purchase forms dating back more than 15 years. Many bore Walter's handwriting. Ryan recognized it immediately. The second box held similar records. The third was different. Several folders were missing sections entirely. Some papers had torn edges where pages appeared to have been removed from stapled sets. Other documents had been inserted on newer paper whose brightness contrasted sharply with the older forms around them. On several purchase sheets, Walter's name appeared at the bottom, but the typeface, spacing, and formatting did not match the surrounding originals. Ryan photographed the condition of the boxes and called Walter. Less than an hour later, Walter arrived at the school wearing his brown work jacket and carrying reading glasses he almost never admitted needing. Ranger greeted him with a brief wag before settling again, but Walter barely noticed. The moment he began examining the records, his expression changed. He remembered these forms. Not every page, not every date, but enough. Walter had kept careful copies of almost everything he ordered because maintenance budgets were often tight. And he had spent much of his career defending why a school needed 10 replacement valves instead of 6, or why cheap paint ultimately cost more when it had to be redone twice. He pulled one original inventory request from the first box, 12 gallons of floor sealant. The corresponding document attached to the lawsuit listed 32. Another showed 6 replacement sink faucets. The lawsuit claimed 18. An electrical request Walter remembered because the parts had taken weeks to arrive listed 4 ballast units. The district's complaint showed 14. The differences were too consistent to be clerical errors. Someone had taken ordinary maintenance orders and expanded them. Not randomly, deliberately. Walter turned through the files with increasing disbelief, occasionally pausing where entire pages had been removed. Ryan watched his father's face more than the documents. Walter was not merely angry. He looked wounded by the idea that the records he had kept so carefully had been altered into something ugly. Before either man could say more, a woman appeared in the doorway. Elaine Porter was 64, a white history teacher with a slim build, shoulder-length silver blonde hair, and a calm, observant face made sharper by rimless glasses. She had taught at the school for 31 years and possessed the quiet confidence of someone who had survived several principals, countless curriculum changes, and more district meetings than she cared to remember. Students respected her because she rarely raised her voice, and adults sometimes underestimated her for exactly the same reason. She had heard Walter was in the building and came to see him. When she saw the boxes, her expression tightened. Elaine knew Douglas Crane. Not socially, she explained, but well enough through budget meetings. Douglas was 51, tall, polished, and careful about appearances, with neatly styled dark hair beginning to gray at the temples and a habit of wearing expensive shirts even during routine school inspections. He had taken control of facility spending several years earlier and quickly earned a reputation for speaking about efficiency while cutting actual access to basic repairs. Elaine told Ryan something that had bothered her for months, since Douglas took over more direct control of maintenance budgets. The school had repeatedly been told that additional money was being allocated for repairs, yet classrooms became colder. Plumbing problems lasted longer. Ceiling leaks returned. Paint peeled. Teachers were told new equipment had been ordered, but sometimes nothing arrived. She had assumed the district was simply inefficient. Now she was no longer certain. Walter looked around the old storage room, at the altered forms, at the missing pages, at the boxes that should have been somewhere else. Then at Ranger, who had finally settled beside Ryan as though his work for the moment was done. That morning, Ryan had entered the school hoping to find a mistake. Instead, Ranger had led him to something far more serious. The records did not merely suggest Walter had been falsely accused. They suggested that someone had gone back through years of honest work, changed the numbers, hidden the originals, and built a case around a man they believed would never know where to look. By the following afternoon, Ryan had moved beyond comparing Walter's handwritten records with the district's altered purchase orders and had begun examining the vendors connected to those transactions. Working from the copies he had legally obtained and cross-checking dates, prices, and company names from the kitchen table in Walter's house, where Ranger lay stretched beneath the window while Walter moved quietly between the stove and the counter, pretending not to watch every page his son turned. One company appeared often enough to become impossible to ignore: North Ridge Facilities, LLC. At first, there was nothing unusual about the name, because school districts routinely used private vendors for equipment, replacement parts, and larger maintenance orders. But the more Ryan compared the invoices, the stranger the pattern became. North Ridge had supplied everything from industrial floor sealant and electrical ballasts to plumbing fixtures and commercial paint. Yet, almost every item had been billed at prices far above what comparable suppliers charged. A box of replacement valves that normally cost a little over $400 had been listed at nearly $1,200. A batch of lighting components appeared at more than twice the standard market price. Paint, hardware, and cleaning materials showed the same pattern, not once or twice, but repeatedly across years. Ryan was careful not to treat suspicion as proof, because police work had taught him that patterns could look meaningful long before they became evidence. But he also knew that fraud often hid in repetition. One inflated invoice could be an error. 20 was a system. Walter sat across from him, wearing his old brown work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold long before he remembered to drink it. He knew prices too well to dismiss what Ryan had found, because he had spent decades stretching maintenance budgets until every dollar had been used twice in his head before it was ever spent once in reality. When Ryan showed him the Northridge invoices, Walter's expression slowly tightened. He remembered some of the orders, but not the company. That bothered him more than the inflated prices. Walter had always known who supplied his materials, partly because he had been the one who dealt with delays, shortages, substitutions, and damaged shipments. Northridge Facilities did not fit into those memories. The name existed across the paperwork, yet not in the ordinary history of the job. Ryan searched the company registration information available through public business records and found an address on the west side of Spokane, listed as a commercial office suite in a modest strip of professional buildings. The next morning, he drove there on his own time. The address led him to a narrow unit between a tax preparation office and a small insurance agency. But the windows were dark, the blinds were closed, and a faded leasing notice had been taped to the inside of the glass. The company name did not appear on the door. No delivery vehicles were parked nearby. No storage space existed behind the building, and nothing about the property suggested that a business capable of supplying large quantities of industrial school materials had ever operated there. Ryan stood on the sidewalk for a while, studying the place without entering. He could not search it. He could not seize anything. He could only observe. Still, what he saw added another weight to the growing suspicion. North Ridge Facilities existed beautifully on paper. In the real world, it seemed almost hollow. When Ryan returned to Walter's house, he found his father in the garage repairing the wooden arm of an old porch chair for a neighbor who had not asked him to do it. Walter had noticed the crack 3 days earlier and apparently decided that noticing a broken object created some form of personal obligation. Ryan told him about the closed office. Walter listened while sanding the wood. Then, after several minutes of silence. He remembered something he had not thought about in nearly 2 years. It had happened during the final months of his employment. The district had announced another increase in the maintenance budget, something that should have made Walter's job easier. Yet supplies were becoming harder to obtain rather than easier. Requests that once took days began taking weeks. Basic items arrived in smaller quantities. Repairs approved on paper remained unfinished in the building. Walter had started comparing what he requested with the monthly numbers he could see in internal summaries, and the figures did not match. At first, he assumed the accounting department had grouped expenses differently. Then he found one order for plumbing supplies that showed nearly 3 times the amount he remembered requesting. Walter had asked about it, not formally, not dramatically. He had simply walked into an administrative office and mentioned the discrepancy to Douglas Crane. Douglas had been relatively new to his expanded role at the time. A 51-year-old white man with carefully combed dark hair graying near the temples, a lean build, expensive shirts, and a polished manner that made even dismissive answers sound courteous. He spoke often about efficiency, restructuring, and modernizing old systems, and many employees found him difficult to read because he rarely lost his temper and almost never raised his voice. Walter remembered Douglas smiling. He remembered being told that accounting codes had changed and that maintenance staff did not need to concern themselves with district-level purchasing structures. Walter had not liked the answer, but he had gone back to work. 2 weeks later, he had been called into a meeting and informed that the district was reorganizing several maintenance positions. Walter was already near retirement age, so the suggestion had been presented as an opportunity to leave early with dignity rather than as a dismissal. At the time, Walter had accepted it. He had spent 38 years working. He was tired. He believed institutions could be clumsy without being malicious. Now, sitting in the garage beside Ryan, he saw the timing differently. Ryan did too. If Walter had noticed inflated purchasing numbers before his retirement, and if the altered records had continued under his name afterward, then his departure may not have been a convenient administrative decision at all. He may have seen something he was never meant to see. That possibility changed the nature of the case. A few days later, Ryan returned to the old maintenance storage area with permission to review more of the records already discovered. Ranger accompanied him again, officially because Ryan had training afterward and practically because the dog had become part of every step Ryan took through that building. Walter came too. The old storage room had been left largely unchanged since their previous visit, although the 3 archive boxes had been moved onto a table for easier review. Ryan began photographing missing sections and cataloging dates while Walter tried to identify which documents belonged to which periods. Ranger wandered only within the limited area Ryan allowed him. For several minutes, the German Shepherd showed no unusual interest in anything. Then he moved toward the back of the room. Walter's old workbench still stood against one wall beneath a shelf lined with damaged clamps, dried paintbrushes, and containers of mismatched screws. The bench was scarred across the surface from decades of use, with a dark circular burn near one corner where someone had once set down something too hot. Ranger lowered his head. His nose moved along the floor beneath the bench. Then he stopped. Ryan looked over. The dog inhaled again, shifted several inches, and scratched lightly at one floorboard. Walter frowned. The flooring in that section was old tongue-and-groove wood laid over a shallow service cavity, and Walter knew every part of it because he had repaired sections himself years earlier. Ranger scratched again. Ryan moved the dog back and crouched. One board looked slightly different from the others. Not newer, just disturbed. The dust line around its edge was broken, and 2 screw heads showed marks that suggested they had been turned more recently than the surrounding hardware. Walter noticed immediately. He said the board had never been fastened that way when he worked there. Ryan did not pry it open without permission. He called the school administrator, explained what they had found, and waited until Thomas Reed joined them and authorization was given to lift the board. When it came free, a narrow dark space appeared beneath. Inside lay a black waterproof pouch. For a moment, no one spoke. Ryan pulled on gloves before removing it. The pouch contained 2 items, an old USB drive and a small black notebook. Walter stared at the notebook before Ryan even opened it. He recognized the handwriting on the cover. Frank Donnelly. Frank had been the school district's senior accounting clerk for nearly 20 years. A thin white man with wire-frame glasses, sparse gray hair, and the nervous habit of tapping a pen against his lower lip whenever numbers did not make sense. He had been quiet, meticulous, and almost painfully cautious. The kind of employee who saved receipts other people threw away and could remember which budget code had changed 5 years earlier without checking a manual. Frank had retired shortly after Walter. He had died the previous year after a stroke. Walter remembered him as a decent man who disliked conflict and preferred numbers because numbers, unlike people, were supposed to behave. The notebook contained abbreviated entries, vendor names, invoice numbers, and several references to Northridge facilities, along with short handwritten notes indicating adjustments made after original requests had been submitted. Ryan did not interpret more than the pages clearly allowed. The USB was more significant, after its contents were copied and reviewed through proper channels. Ryan found scanned invoices and saved email printouts showing that Douglas Crane had repeatedly instructed accounting staff to alter quantities, consolidate orders, and approve substitutions after Walter's original requests had already been submitted. One email referred to changing 12 units to 30. Another directed an employee to process an amended vendor invoice without returning it to maintenance for verification. A third referenced Northridge directly and instructed that the revised total be approved under an existing maintenance authorization. The pieces were beginning to align. Walter's original requests, inflated quantities, Northridge's inflated prices, Douglas's instructions, Frank's hidden records, Walter's early retirement. Ryan sat with the evidence spread before him and felt the case becoming clearer, but not complete. There was still a hole at the center of it. The documents showed manipulation. They showed that Douglas had ordered changes. They showed that Northridge benefited. But they did not show where the money ultimately went. There was no bank record tying Douglas personally to the company. No payment to him. No ownership document. No transfer. Nothing proving that he had received $1 without that final connection. Douglas could still claim he had approved vendor adjustments in good faith, blamed subordinates for improper accounting, or argued that Northridge had simply overcharged the district without his knowledge. Walter looked at Ryan and understood the problem from his expression alone. They had found enough to know that someone had built the lie around him. They had even found the hands that seemed to have shaped parts of it. But knowing who stood near the fire was not the same as proving who had lit it. Ranger settled beside Walter's chair, his head resting near the old man's boot as he had done so many times before, while Ryan looked once more at Frank Donnelly's notebook and the files recovered from beneath the floor. They were closer than they had ever been, close enough to see the outline of the truth, but not yet close enough to hold it. By the end of that week, the quiet pattern Ryan had been following had begun to disturb people beyond Walter's kitchen table, because questions that had once seemed harmless were now touching records someone clearly preferred to keep buried. Douglas Crane had not confronted Ryan directly, nor had he sent any message that could be interpreted as a threat, but several employees at the school suddenly became less willing to talk. Old maintenance files were harder to locate, and one storage area behind the athletic wing was emptied without explanation, sometime between Friday evening and Saturday morning. By Monday, shelves that had held boxes for years stood bare, and the dust outlines where those boxes had rested were clearer than any inventory list. Ryan noticed the change immediately. He also understood the limits of what he could do. The civil case against Walter had not yet become Ryan's criminal investigation, and being a police officer did not give him the right to follow people, search vehicles, or treat school employees as suspects simply because his father had been accused. If anything, his personal connection required him to be more careful than another officer might have been. because one reckless step could allow Douglas or the district's attorneys to claim that Ryan had abused his position to interfere with a lawsuit involving his own family. That knowledge frustrated him more than he admitted. Walter, meanwhile, watched the strain growing in his son with increasing unease. The old man had never liked seeing Ryan carry problems home from work, and now the problem was Walter himself. On Tuesday morning, Ryan returned to the maintenance wing with Ranger to review a small set of documents that had been left behind after the storage room was cleared. Thomas Reed, the head custodian, met him near the loading area and looked more uncomfortable than usual. Thomas explained that two men had arrived late Friday with instructions from district administration to remove outdated records and broken equipment. But he had not been given their names and had assumed the order was routine. Ryan asked who had authorized it. Thomas hesitated before admitting that the paperwork carried Douglas Crane's office code. That alone proved very little. District administrators moved records all the time. Still, the timing was difficult to ignore. The room itself contained almost nothing now except a damaged shelf, several empty paint cans, a torn canvas tarp, and a small pile of discarded work gloves near the wall. Ranger moved through the space beside Ryan with his usual steady discipline. Nose lowered only occasionally as he took in the room. Then he stopped at the gloves. Most were old, stiff with paint, oil, or plaster dust. Ranger ignored the first few. At the fourth, a dark leather work glove with a split seam near the thumb, his behavior changed. His head lifted slightly. He sniffed again. Then he looked toward the loading door. Ryan knew that look. Ranger was not merely interested in an object. He recognized something. The German Shepherd had been trained to distinguish and follow human scent under controlled conditions. And although Ryan could not simply declare glove evidence because Ranger reacted to it, he understood what the dog's response meant in practical terms. Whoever had handled that glove had likely been present recently enough for the scent to remain distinct. Thomas studied the dog and quietly said he had seen one of the men wearing black work gloves while carrying boxes out Friday night. Ryan asked whether Thomas had ever seen the man before. Thomas thought for a moment. Then he said yes. Not often. The man had appeared at the school several times during the previous year, usually with vendor deliveries or after-hours maintenance pickups. And Thomas believed he was connected to Northridge facilities. That was enough to give Ryan a direction, but still not enough to justify acting on his own. He photographed the glove where it lay, documented Thomas's statement, and contacted his supervisor before doing anything further. Ryan's supervisor was Lieutenant Marcus Hale, a 53-year-old white man with close-cropped gray hair, a lean build, and a face that seemed permanently composed even when he was irritated. Marcus had spent nearly 3 decades in law enforcement and had learned to distrust both coincidences and officers who became emotionally invested in their own cases. He respected Ryan, but he also knew the danger of allowing family loyalty to blur legal judgment. When Ryan explained the forged records, Northridge invoices, Frank Donnelly's hidden USB, the recently cleared storage area, and Ranger's reaction to the glove, Marcus listened without interruption. His answer was cautious. Ryan was not to investigate further as an acting officer. He could preserve what he had already observed and submit everything through the proper channels. If the Financial Crimes Unit believed there was enough to open a case, they would take it from there. Ryan accepted the restriction, though he did not like it. Later that afternoon, with permission from the department and using publicly accessible traffic camera records that investigators were allowed to review, Ryan helped identify vehicle movement near the school around the time the storage area had been emptied. The footage was imperfect. Rain streaked across several camera lenses, and one intersection camera captured only partial plates. Still, shortly after 11 on Friday night, a white commercial truck appeared on a public road 2 blocks from the school. The side panel carried a faded blue logo, Northridge Facilities, LLC. The truck entered the area. 47 minutes later, it left. Its rear compartment appeared noticeably fuller. The image was not clear enough to identify the driver, but the vehicle existed. The company existed, and it had been near the school exactly when years of records disappeared. Ryan prepared a formal report. He included everything he could document without speculation: the altered maintenance files, the post-retirement purchase orders under Walter's name, the inflation patterns, the Northridge vendor history, the abandoned office address, Frank Donnelly's records, Douglas Crane's adjustment instructions, Thomas Reed's account of the late-night removal, the glove, and the traffic camera footage. The report went to the department's financial crimes unit. For the first time, the matter moved beyond Ryan's private concern for his father. Detective Laura Chen was assigned as the initial reviewing investigator, a 41-year-old Asian-American woman with shoulder-length black hair, a compact athletic build, and the calm, skeptical manner of someone who spent most of her career untangling crimes hidden behind spreadsheets rather than broken windows. She had a reputation for moving slowly at the beginning of a case and very quickly once the numbers began to speak. Laura warned Ryan that because Walter was his father, Ryan's future involvement would be limited. Ryan understood. More importantly, she confirmed that the pattern was serious enough to justify an official financial review. That evening, Ryan drove to Walter's house with Ranger. The porch light was on. Walter was sitting at the kitchen table when they entered, the lawsuit papers stacked neatly beside him. He looked older than he had a week earlier. Not weaker, just more tired. Ryan told him the Financial Crimes Unit had opened a preliminary investigation, and that another detective would now handle the evidence independently. Walter should have looked relieved. Instead, he lowered his eyes. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he told Ryan that perhaps they should stop. Ryan thought he had misheard him. Walter explained that the school district's attorney had contacted him again through formal channels and mentioned the possibility of a settlement. If Walter accepted responsibility for minor unauthorized use of district property and paid a reduced amount, the larger claim might disappear. The offer offended him, but the alternative frightened him for a different reason. Ryan had already spent too much time asking questions. His name was now attached to reports. His K-9 had been involved in finding evidence. If Douglas had influence inside the district, Walter feared he might begin making complaints against Ryan, accusing him of intimidation, conflict of interest, or misuse of police authority. Walter could tolerate people calling him a thief. What he could not tolerate was the thought that Ryan's career might be damaged because the son he had raised refused to walk away from his father's trouble. Ryan's response came faster and sharper than he intended. He reminded Walter that settling would place an admission beside his name, and once it existed, no one would care about the fine print. People would remember only that Walter Bennett had admitted wrongdoing. Walter answered that reputations could be repaired. Ryan said some things should not have to be repaired when they were never broken. The argument rose slowly, not through shouting, but through years of love expressed badly under pressure. Walter insisted that he was 72, retired, and had little left to lose. Ryan reminded him that his life had never been measured by what he personally could afford to lose. Walter pushed back, saying Ryan had worked too hard to become an officer and should not risk everything over an old man who could survive a few ugly rumors. For the first time, Ryan's anger turned personal. He asked Walter whether that was truly what the old man believed he was now, a burden to be managed, a problem worth sacrificing because he was old enough to endure it. Walter looked away. The silence that followed was worse than the argument. Ranger had been lying near the doorway throughout the exchange, ears shifting between the two men as their voices tightened, when the room finally went quiet. The 6-year-old German shepherd rose without command. He walked first to Ryan, then to Walter. Instead of choosing one, Ranger sat directly between them. He leaned his broad shoulder against Walter's leg and rested his head gently on the old man's knee. Walter's hand moved almost automatically to the dog's neck. Ranger remained there. No command, no trained alert, just presence. The tension in Walter's shoulders eased. Ryan watched the same dog who had led them to hidden records now do something simpler and, for that moment, more important. He reminded both men what neither was saying properly. They were not on opposite sides. Ryan sat down across from Walter and spoke more quietly. 27 years earlier, Walter had found a 9-year-old boy hiding in a cold equipment room. He had not asked whether helping that child would cost him money, time, comfort, or reputation. He had simply seen someone who needed him and stayed. Ryan had spent most of his life trying to become the kind of man Walter had taught him to be. He could not honor that lesson by walking away now. Walter kept one hand on Ranger's head while listening. Ryan told him there was a difference between recklessness and loyalty. He would not cross legal lines. He would not misuse his badge. The official investigation now belonged to people with no family connection to Walter. But, as a son, he was staying. That part was not negotiable. Walter's eyes moved from Ryan to Ranger and back again. He did not apologize. Walter Bennett had never been particularly talented at apologies. Instead, he reached across the table and straightened one corner of Ryan's report that was not actually crooked. Ryan understood. Outside, winter rain began striking the windows again. Inside, the old man, the police officer, and the German shepherd remained together around the kitchen table while, somewhere beyond that small house, the first official investigation into Northridge facilities and Douglas Crane quietly began. By the middle of the following week, the lawsuit against Walter Bennett was no longer something contained inside court filings, police reports, and a few worried conversations around his kitchen table. Because word had begun to travel through Spokane in the ordinary way small communities carried news, moving from one former teacher to another, from parents to grown children, from retired staff to neighbors who remembered Walter not as a defendant in a civil case, but as the quiet maintenance man who had spent nearly 40 years fixing things nobody else noticed until they stopped working. Walter disliked the attention almost immediately. He had never been comfortable with people gathering around him for reasons that had nothing to do with a leaking pipe or a broken door. And when the first former student appeared on his porch one cold afternoon, Walter assumed the young man had come because something in the house needed repair. Instead, 32-year-old Daniel Harper, a white man with sandy brown hair, a narrow face, and strong shoulders developed from years of wheelchair basketball, rolled himself up the short ramp beside Walter's porch and placed an old photograph on the kitchen table. Daniel had been born with spina bifida and had used a wheelchair since childhood, but he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years refusing to let strangers decide what his life should look like. The photograph showed Daniel at 11 years old sitting in a battered blue wheelchair outside the school gym, while Walter knelt beside one of the wheels with a wrench in his hand. Daniel remembered the day clearly. A rear bearing had failed just before a school assembly, and his mother had been working 2 jobs at the time. With no money for a replacement chair and barely enough for the specialized repair, Walter had disappeared into the maintenance room, returned with tools, spent nearly 2 hours rebuilding the damaged assembly, then purchased a replacement bearing with his own money after discovering the school did not have the correct part. Daniel had only learned years later that Walter had paid for it himself. Walter remembered the wheel. He did not remember paying for the bearing. That difference seemed to matter to Daniel. He explained that Walter had fixed much more than a piece of metal that day, because at 11 years old, Daniel had already become accustomed to adults discussing his limitations in front of him as though he were not in the room, while Walter had simply crouched beside the chair, repaired what was broken, and sent him back to class without making him feel helpless. Walter listened awkwardly, looking more at the photograph than at Daniel, when Daniel offered to write a statement about Walter's character. Walter tried to dismiss the idea as unnecessary. Daniel refused. The next person came 2 days later. Her name was Margaret Ellis, a 69-year-old retired English teacher. A tall white woman with short silver hair, a straight back, and a voice that still carried the measured authority of someone who had spent 40 years convincing teenagers that deadlines were real. She and Walter had worked in the same school for more than 2 decades, and although they had never been close friends outside of work, She remembered countless Saturdays when Walter appeared in the building without ever listing the hours on his overtime sheet. He repaired stage lights before school plays, painted classrooms during holiday weekends, helped teachers move furniture between rooms, replaced broken shelving after storms. When Margaret once asked why he did not claim the extra hours, Walter had answered that the maintenance budget was already strained, and there was no sense charging the school for time he was willing to give. Margaret had thought the answer foolish at the time. Now, she found herself angry that the same institution had turned that generosity into an accusation. She brought old staff emails showing Walter volunteering for unpaid weekend repairs, along with several photographs from school events where he could be seen working in the background long after his regular shift should have ended. Walter looked at the photographs with visible discomfort. He had always preferred being the person behind the ladder rather than the one people noticed standing on it. More people followed. One of them was Teresa Caldwell, 56, a white mother of 3 with shoulder-length brown hair streaked with gray and the soft-spoken manner of someone who had spent much of her adult life caring for others before herself. Her youngest son had attended the school almost 20 years earlier during one of the coldest winters Spokane had seen in decades. The heating system in his classroom failed during a week when temperatures fell well below freezing, and the district repair request had been delayed because replacement parts were supposedly unavailable. Walter had refused to let 20 children spend their days wearing coats indoors. He found a compatibles part at a local supplier, drove across town after his shift, paid for it personally when the district purchase approval did not come through in time, and returned before dawn the next morning to repair the unit. The class was warm when the children arrived. Teresa remembered because her son had come home talking about Mr. Bennett as though he were some kind of magician who could command heaters to obey him. Walter remembered the repair. He did not remember Teresa. That, too, seemed to move her more than it would have if he had. Within days, statements began accumulating on Ryan's table, not dramatic declarations, but small records of an ordinary man's life: a repaired wheelchair, an unpaid Saturday, a warm classroom, a broken backpack fixed, a porch rail strengthened for an elderly neighbor, a leaking church sink repaired before Sunday service. None of those acts proved Walter had not stolen money, and Ryan was careful not to confuse affection with evidence. But they revealed something the lawsuit could never show on its own. Walter Bennett had lived for decades as though small kindnesses disappeared the moment they were finished. They had not. People remembered. Elaine Porter added something more concrete. She arrived one evening carrying a thick folder and a flash drive, her silver blonde hair damp from freezing drizzle and her expression more determined than Ryan had seen before. During the years since Douglas Crane took greater control over facilities spending, Elaine had quietly documented maintenance failures because she had grown tired of submitting the same requests again and again. The folder contained photographs of a cracked sink that had supposedly been replaced, a hallway ceiling marked as repaired despite spreading water stains, a classroom heater listed as serviced though it remained broken for months, and an emergency exit whose damaged latch had been reported repeatedly. More important were the emails. Several district messages informed the staff that work had been completed on specific dates. Elaine's photographs, taken after those dates, showed that nothing had changed. Ryan compared the project numbers in the emails with invoices already connected to Northridge facilities. The numbers matched. Money had been charged. Repairs had been declared finished. The building remained broken. Detective Laura Chen took custody of the materials and added them to the expanding financial investigation, which by then had progressed far enough for investigators to obtain legal authority to seize records and property connected to Northridge. Among the items recovered from the company's white commercial truck were several old binders, loose invoices, work gloves, 2 damaged laptops, and a heavy metal toolbox that appeared unremarkable enough to receive little attention during the first inventory. Ranger was brought to the evidence facility several days later at Laura's request, not as a magical solution to a paper crime, but because investigators wanted to determine whether the scent connection Ryan had noticed earlier could be tied more clearly to the items recovered from the truck. The evidence warehouse occupied a secure municipal building away from the school, with concrete floors, metal shelving, fluorescent lights, and rows of sealed containers marked with case numbers. Ranger entered beside Ryan under controlled conditions, his black and tan coat catching the bright overhead light while his posture shifted immediately into the focused discipline of working mode. Several recovered items were presented separately. Ranger showed mild interest in some. Then he reached the metal toolbox. His behavior changed. He sniffed around the lid, moved to one side, then returned to the same lower corner repeatedly. Laura watched carefully. The toolbox had already been opened during inventory, and nothing unusual had been recorded inside beyond common hand tools, electrical tape, fasteners, and several old receipts. Ranger, however, continued directing his nose toward the bottom. Laura authorized a closer examination. An investigator removed the tools, then lifted the rubber liner. Nothing appeared beneath it at first. Then one corner of the metal base gave slightly under pressure. The toolbox contained a false bottom. Inside was a flat waterproof envelope. The room became still. Laura opened it according to evidence procedure. What emerged was not cash. It was better. Bank statements, transfer slips, printed transaction confirmations. Several belonged to Northridge Facilities, LLC. Others belonged to a second company Ryan had never seen before, Crane Consulting Group. Laura ran the registration information. The owner was Melissa Crane, Douglas Crane's wife. Melissa was 48, a white woman with auburn hair and a background in office management who had left full-time employment several years earlier on paper. Crane Consulting Group offered administrative and procurement consulting services. Yet investigators could find almost no evidence of actual clients, employees, or operating activity beyond deposits. The financial documents revealed a repeating pattern. Payments entered Northridge from school district contracts within days. Substantial portions of those funds were transferred to Crane Consulting Group under vague descriptions such as consulting fees, vendor coordination, and administrative services. Some transfers occurred within 48 hours of the exact inflated invoices Walter had questioned. Others aligned with purchase orders altered after Walter's retirement. Taken separately, each transaction might have required explanation. Together, they formed a trail. Money had moved from the district to Northridge, then from Northridge to a company controlled by Douglas Crane's household. For the first time, investigators had more than altered documents and suspicious instructions. They had direct financial movement. Laura did not celebrate. She simply stood beside the evidence table, studying the statements with the quiet concentration Ryan had come to recognize as her version of certainty. The case had changed. Douglas could no longer easily claim that Northridge had overcharged the school without his knowledge. He could no longer separate himself from the vendor by pointing to paperwork. The money had reached a company owned by his wife. When Ryan told Walter that evening, the old man remained silent for a long time. Ranger sat beside his chair. On the table lay Daniel's photograph, Margaret's old emails, Teresa's written statement, Elaine's evidence, and copies of the newly documented financial transfers. Walter looked over all of it as though he were seeing a version of his life he had never known existed. For decades, he had believed that repairing something meant finishing the job and moving on. He had never considered that people might carry those moments with them. Now those people had returned, and somewhere inside the evidence warehouse, a dog who refused to forget a scent had helped uncover the one thing Walter needed most. Not gratitude. Proof. The civil case against him had been built to make him look like the man who stole from the school. For the first time, the evidence was beginning to point clearly in the opposite direction, toward the man who had built the lie. The morning of the hearing arrived beneath a hard white sky over Spokane, with patches of old snow clinging to shaded sidewalks and a thin wind moving between the downtown buildings as Walter Bennett climbed the courthouse steps in the same Navy suit he had worn years earlier to Ryan's police academy graduation, a suit that had never fit perfectly across his shoulders but had become in Walter's mind, the closest thing he owned to formal armor at 72. Walter looked smaller inside it than he once had, not because he had become frail, but because the past several weeks had taken something from the way he carried himself. His silver-white hair had been combed carefully, his shoes polished, and his hands rested flat against his knees after he took his seat at the defense table. Yet the deep lines around his pale blue eyes revealed a tiredness that no clean shirt or pressed jacket could hide. He had spent nearly 40 years repairing a public school. And now he sat in a courtroom while the same institution tried to convince a judge that those decades had been a cover for theft. Across the aisle sat Douglas Crane. Douglas was 51, tall and lean, with dark hair brushed neatly away from his forehead, a charcoal suit that looked newly tailored, and the controlled expression of a man who had built much of his life around appearing composed, even under pressure. He carried himself with the polished confidence that had once made employees reluctant to challenge him, and beside him sat the district's attorney, Martin Shaw, a 58-year-old white man with a narrow face, steel-gray hair, and the careful manner of someone who rarely wasted words unless those words were billable. Walter's own legal representation had been arranged only after the financial investigation began to produce serious evidence. But that morning he still felt strangely alone at the table. The attorneys reviewed documents. Court staff moved quietly between desks. Reporters whispered near the back bench. Walter kept his eyes on the wood grain in front of him and tried not to think about how quickly a reputation built over 38 years could be compressed into a stack of accusations. Then the courtroom doors opened. The sound was not loud, but it changed the room. Ryan Mitchell entered in uniform. At 36, Ryan carried the steady posture of an experienced police officer, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his blue-gray eyes focused straight ahead, and his expression controlled despite the emotion he had spent days trying to keep separate from the official process. Ranger walked at his left side, the 6-year-old German Shepherd moving with calm precision, his black and tan coat groomed, ears upright, and gaze alert without being restless. Behind them came Elaine Porter, then Daniel Harper in his wheelchair, Margaret Ellis, Teresa Caldwell, Thomas Reed, several retired teachers, former students, parents, neighbors, people Walter had helped in ways he had forgotten almost as soon as he had done them. The room fell quiet. Walter turned. For a moment, he looked less like a defendant and more like a man who had suddenly discovered that an entire part of his life had been following him without his knowledge. Ryan did not smile. Neither did Walter. But their eyes met. That was enough. Ryan was not there as Walter's attorney, and the court had taken care to keep his role narrow because of the family relationship. His purpose was to testify about how the initial inconsistencies had been discovered and how the evidence had then been transferred to independent investigators. While Detective Laura Chen and the Financial Crimes Unit would present the official chain of evidence, the hearing began with the district's argument. Martin Shaw laid out the accusation in careful sequence purchase orders, vendor invoices, maintenance materials, and signatures bearing Walter Bennett's name. He emphasized the amount at issue and suggested that the years of irregularities revealed not a mistake, but a pattern. Walter listened without reacting. He had heard the accusations before. What had changed was what now existed behind them. When Laura Chen took the stand, the shape of the case began to shift. She described the purchase orders filed after Walter's retirement, documents bearing his name even though he no longer had access to school purchasing systems. She presented copies of Walter's original maintenance logs recovered from the concealed storage boxes and demonstrated how those records showed smaller quantities than the district invoices later attributed to him. 12 gallons had become 32. 6 fixtures had become 18. 4 electrical ballasts had become 14. The altered documents were not isolated. They formed a pattern. Laura then explained where the original records had been found. Hidden behind a plywood panel inside a maintenance storage room instead of being preserved in district archives where they belonged. Photographs showed torn pages, substituted forms, newer paper inserted into older files, and missing sections where original documentation had been removed. The courtroom remained unusually still. Ryan testified next. He explained that he had first noticed purchase orders dated months after Walter's retirement and that, because of his personal relationship to the defendant, he had not attempted to turn the matter into his own investigation. He described how Ranger had drawn attention to the locked storage room and later to the disturbed floor beneath Walter's old workbench. While every significant discovery had been documented and transferred through proper channels, Martin Shaw attempted to weaken that testimony by suggesting that a police officer defending his adoptive father had every reason to see wrongdoing where none existed. Ryan did not argue emotionally. He simply repeated that once the evidence crossed into possible financial crime, he stepped back and independent investigators took control. That restraint mattered. So did Ranger. The German Shepherd sat quietly near the rear of the courtroom beside another canine handler while Ryan testified, almost invisible until people remembered that several of the most important discoveries would never have been made without him. Then came Frank Donnelly's USB. Laura presented the recovered emails showing Douglas Crane directing staff to increase quantities, approve amended invoices, and process Northridge Facilities orders without returning them to maintenance for verification. The next set of evidence came from Elaine Porter. She took the stand in a dark blue jacket, her silver blonde hair pinned neatly behind her ears, and described years of maintenance requests that had been marked complete while classrooms remained cold. Sinks remained cracked, ceilings continued leaking, and emergency exits stayed damaged. Her photographs were placed beside the corresponding invoices. The contrast was difficult to explain away. Money had supposedly been spent. Work had supposedly been completed. The building itself said otherwise. Then the financial records were introduced. Northridge Facilities had received district money through inflated contracts. Within days of many of those payments, large transfers had moved into Crane Consulting Group. The company registered to Douglas's wife, Melissa Crane. The amounts lined up too closely with the questionable invoices to be dismissed as coincidence. Douglas's defense shifted. His attorney argued that Northridge was an independent vendor, that accounting staff processed much of the paperwork, and that Walter himself could have cooperated with suppliers while Douglas merely approved routine administrative requests. For the first time that morning, Walter looked directly at Douglas. The accusation was almost elegant in its cruelty. After everything already uncovered, Douglas was still trying to place Walter at the center of the fraud. Then Laura Chen asked to submit one final document. It was a purchase order carrying Walter Bennett's name and what appeared to be his signature. The order was dated March 14th, nearly 3 years earlier. The district claimed Walter had approved a large shipment of electrical components that day. Laura placed another record beside it, a hospital admission form. Walter had undergone abdominal surgery on March 13th. He had remained hospitalized through March 16th. Medical records confirmed he had been under post-operative care on the exact day the purchase order was supposedly signed. Walter could not have signed it. He could not have submitted it. He had not even been inside the school. For the first time, Douglas moved visibly in his chair. Not dramatically, just enough. His shoulders stiffened. His hand stopped moving across the legal pad in front of him. The judge noticed. So did Ryan. So did everyone who had spent the morning watching the case unravel piece by piece. The district's attorney asked for time to respond. The judge, Honorable Rebecca Monroe, a 62-year-old white woman with short gray hair, a composed face, and the reputation of someone who valued records more than theatrics, reviewed the evidence in silence for several minutes before speaking. Her decision was direct. The civil complaint against Walter Bennett was dismissed. Not reduced, not delayed, dismissed. She further ordered that the court record, financial documentation, vendor evidence, altered purchase orders, and related materials be formally referred for criminal investigation into suspected fraud, forgery, and misuse of public funds. Walter did not react immediately. He sat still as though his mind had understood the words before the rest of him had caught up. Behind him, someone began to cry quietly. Teresa covered her mouth. Daniel lowered his head. Elaine closed her eyes for a moment. Ryan simply watched Walter. Outside the courtroom, events moved faster. By then, Laura Chen's unit had already obtained enough independent evidence to support criminal action, and the court's ruling removed much of the final uncertainty surrounding the fraudulent paper trail. Douglas Crane was approached in the courthouse corridor by two investigators. He did not resist. The polished expression remained for several seconds longer than seemed possible. Then it disappeared. He was placed under arrest on allegations involving financial fraud, falsification of records, and misappropriation of public funds. People gathered in the hallway, but Walter did not watch Douglas being led away. He turned instead toward Ryan. Ranger stood between them, his ears forward and tail low, waiting as if the entire courthouse were simply another place where his job was to remain close to the people he trusted. Walter reached down and rested one hand against the dog's neck. Then he looked at his son. 4 weeks. Walter had been afraid that his name would remain attached to the word thief long after the facts stopped mattering. Now the word belonged somewhere else. Ryan stepped closer. Neither man needed a speech. Walter had once taught a frightened 9-year-old boy that courage meant stepping forward when someone needed you. That morning, the boy had returned as a man, and he had not come alone. Several months after the civil case against Walter Bennett was dismissed, Spokane moved into spring with longer evenings, softer rain, and the first green returning to the trees that lined the streets around the old school. The criminal investigation continued through proper channels. Douglas Crane was forced to answer for the financial scheme that had hidden behind inflated contracts and falsified records, and a significant portion of the missing maintenance funds was recovered and returned to the district. For Walter. However, the most important change was not what happened in court files or financial reports, but what began happening inside the building he had spent nearly 4 decades trying to hold together with patience, stubbornness, and more unpaid hours than anyone would ever be able to count. For the first time in years, the school was being repaired properly. The old heating system that had failed classroom after classroom was removed and replaced with a modern unit that no longer rattled through winter mornings or left children wearing coats at their desks. Restrooms that had been patched repeatedly were rebuilt with working sinks, new fixtures, and plumbing that no longer leaked into the walls. Contractors replaced sections of the roof where water had seeped through during heavy rain, and the gymnasium floor was sanded, repaired, and sealed until the long cracks that had once stretched across the wood disappeared beneath a clean finish. Walter visited only twice during the renovation. The first time, Elaine Porter invited him to walk through the building after classes ended. She moved beside him through the corridors with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent too many years filing ignored maintenance requests and had finally seen something change. Walter said little as he inspected the work, though he paused longer than necessary beneath the new roof panels and tested one restroom faucet 3 times as though he did not trust that it would remain dry around the base. When they reached the classroom where Teresa Caldwell's son had once sat through a freezing winter morning, Walter stood near the new heater and held his hand above the vent. Warm air moved across his fingers. He nodded once. That was all. To Elaine, it looked like approval. To Walter, it felt closer to relief. He had never wanted the school to remember his name. He had only wanted the children inside it to be warm, safe, and unaware of how many things adults had to repair before morning. The district, however, had other plans. After the investigation exposed how badly the maintenance system had been abused, the school board voted to hold a small public ceremony acknowledging Walter's decades of service and apologizing for the accusations that had been brought against him. Walter learned about the event from Ryan, who made the mistake of telling him nearly 2 weeks in advance. Walter spent the next 13 days attempting to avoid it. He argued that apologies did not require microphones, that public buildings did not need ceremonies every time someone admitted a mistake, and that Saturday mornings were better used fixing gutters. Ryan ignored every objection. Elaine ignored them too. So did half the people who had already stood behind Walter at the courthouse. On the morning of the ceremony, the renovated gymnasium filled slowly with former students, teachers, parents, district staff, and members of the community. Daniel Harper arrived in his wheelchair wearing a dark blue jacket and carrying the same old photograph of Walter repairing his chair decades earlier. Margaret Ellis sat near the front with Teresa Caldwell, both women smiling whenever Walter looked in their direction and immediately pretending they had not been watching him. Walter wore the navy suit again. It still did not fit perfectly. Ryan thought that was appropriate. Some things did not need fixing. Walter stood near the side of the gym with his hands in his pockets while the new superintendent, Ellen Whitmore, stepped to the microphone. Ellen was 57, a white woman with short chestnut hair, a calm face, and the practical manner of an administrator who had spent most of her career as a principal before moving into district leadership. She had taken over during the aftermath of Douglas's arrest and had quickly developed a reputation for answering uncomfortable questions instead of avoiding them. Her apology was brief and direct. She acknowledged that the district had failed Walter, that his name had been attached to conduct he did not commit, and that the institution owed him more than a legal dismissal. She also thanked him for the decades during which he had quietly kept the school functioning, often giving more than his job required and receiving less recognition than he deserved. Walter looked increasingly uncomfortable with each sentence. Then Ellen announced that the district wanted to name the newly renovated maintenance wing after him. Walter's head lifted immediately. Ryan saw the expression and nearly smiled. The answer came before Ellen could finish explaining. Walter said he did not want an entire wing named after him and suggested that if the district truly wanted to honor him, they could simply make sure the roof was repaired properly this time. The gymnasium broke into laughter. Even Walter smiled. Eventually, a compromise was reached. No wing, no building, no large sign. Instead, beside the door to the maintenance workshop, the district installed a modest brass plaque. Walter Bennett Maintenance Workshop, for the man who quietly kept this school standing. Walter read it twice. Then he ran one finger along the edge and asked who had mounted it. A maintenance worker raised his hand nervously. Walter told him one screw was slightly crooked. The room laughed again. That afternoon, attention shifted to Ranger. The police department held its own brief recognition for the 6-year-old German Shepherd whose persistence had helped lead investigators toward hidden records, the concealed USB, and the evidence trail that eventually exposed the financial scheme. Ranger stood beside Ryan with his black and tan coat brushed clean and his ears upright while an official citation was read aloud. Ranger showed little interest in the words. His attention was fixed on Walter. Walter waited until the ceremony ended, crouched beside the dog, and informed Ryan that Ranger's contribution clearly justified a stake. Ryan reminded him that the veterinarian had specifically warned against feeding Ranger rich table food. Walter looked at the dog. Ranger looked back at Walter. Neither moved. Ryan recognized the silence immediately. It was the same kind of silence Walter had used throughout Ryan's childhood whenever he had technically heard a rule but had already decided whether he agreed with it. Ryan pointed at both of them and warned that he knew exactly what was happening. Walter denied everything. Ranger remained professionally silent. The argument ended there, though Ryan noticed later that Ranger showed suspicious enthusiasm around Walter's kitchen. By evening, the crowd had gone home. The ceremonies were over, and Walter's house returned to the quiet place it had been before lawyers, investigators, teachers, and neighbors began passing through it. Ryan stayed. He had changed out of uniform and sat on the porch in jeans and a dark sweatshirt, while Walter occupied the old wooden chair beside him. Ranger lay across the boards between them, his broad body relaxed, one paw resting near Walter's shoe as the last sunlight stretched through the trees. For a while, neither man spoke. They had never been people who filled silence simply because silence existed. The street was quiet. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower started and stopped. A pair of birds argued from the telephone wire. Ranger sighed deeply in the way dogs sometimes did when human beings failed to understand how exhausting their lives were. Ryan rested his arms across his knees. There was something he had wanted to say for years, but it had always seemed too large to fit into an ordinary conversation. He finally told Walter that he had spent most of his life believing the old man had saved him. Walter turned slightly. Ryan continued, explaining that everything after the equipment room had seemed to begin with Walter's decision to stay the safe house. School, the police academy, his career, Ranger, and every stable thing he had built as an adult. When Ryan looked backward, Walter always stood at the beginning of the road. Walter listened without interrupting. Then he shook his head. He had never told Ryan much about the years before the boy came home with him, partly because Walter believed children should not be given the responsibility of healing adults, and partly because he had never been good at explaining grief. Before Ryan, Walter's house had been quiet in a way that went beyond sound. After the losses he had carried, he had learned how to move from work to home without expecting anything on the other side of the door. He cooked for one person, repaired things no one else noticed, and sometimes went entire evenings without speaking aloud. Then a 9-year-old boy arrived. Suddenly, there were muddy shoes in the hallway. Cabinet doors closed too hard. Milk disappeared faster than Walter could buy it. Homework covered the kitchen table. Someone complained about vegetables. Someone forgot towels on the bathroom floor. Someone needed rides. School forms signed, lunches packed, and reassurance after nightmares he pretended not to have. The old quiet vanished. Walter had thought he was giving Ryan a home. Years later, he understood that Ryan had given life back to the home itself. Walter looked at his son and finally put the truth into the simplest words he could manage. Ryan had not been the only one rescued. The sentence settled between them. Ryan did not answer immediately. There was no need. He reached across and placed one hand on Walter's shoulder. Walter covered it briefly with his own. Ranger raised his head, checked both men, then lowered it again between their feet as though satisfied that the problem had been handled correctly. The light softened across the porch. Walter looked at the old house, at the patched railing he had repaired twice, at the grown man beside him, and at the loyal dog who had somehow become part investigator, part companion, and part bridge between two men who often loved each other more easily than they could say it. Walter had spent most of his life believing broken things belonged in one of two categories: things that could be repaired, and things that could not. Pipes, doors, roofs, heaters, wheels, locks, and damaged floors had always made sense to him because they showed exactly where they hurt. People were different. Their cracks could stay hidden for years. Sometimes they carried grief quietly. Sometimes they mistook loneliness for strength. Sometimes they believed that, because they had survived something alone, they were supposed to keep surviving that way forever. Walter had repaired thousands of broken things. Only near the end of his working life did he understand that people rarely healed because someone knew exactly how to fix them. Sometimes they healed because someone stayed, because someone returned, because one frightened boy grew into a man who refused to leave an old father alone in a courtroom, because one loyal dog followed scents others overlooked and, without knowing anything about money or lawsuits, kept leading people back toward the truth. Walter leaned into his chair as the last sunlight disappeared from the street. For once, there was nothing left that needed repairing before morning. The school was standing. His name was clear. His son was beside him. Ranger was asleep at their feet. And the old house was quiet again. But it was no longer empty. In the end, Walter Bennett's story was never really about a courtroom, a stolen budget, or the man who tried to destroy his name. It was about what remains after a lifetime of quiet kindness. Walter spent decades fixing broken heaters, leaking roofs, damaged wheelchairs, and forgotten corners of an old school, never believing that anyone would remember the small things he did when no one was watching. Yet, when his own life began to fall apart, those small acts returned to him through the people he had helped, through the son he had once taken in, and through a loyal German shepherd who refused to ignore the trail everyone else had missed. Perhaps that is the lesson Walter understood only at the end. Goodness is rarely wasted. Sometimes it takes years to come back. Sometimes it returns as a hand on your shoulder, a crowded courtroom, a son standing beside you, or a faithful dog refusing to walk away. And sometimes the people we believe we are saving are quietly saving us too. What did Walter Ryan and Ranger's story mean to you? Do you believe the kindness we give eventually finds its way back to us? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I would truly love to hear what part of this story stayed with you the most. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel so you can join us for more stories about courage, loyalty, second chances, and the extraordinary bond between people and animals. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Take care of yourself. Take care of those who stay beside you when life gets hard. And please come back again for another story. Until next time.